The camera. Looks like a camera. I was sitting in my room, and then my dad was just yelling, just screaming at my mom. And then I heard a gunshot. I ran out there, and my mom had been shot. He pointed the gun at me. And then he said he was sorry, and then he shot himself.
Is there anything you want to tell me? We all know what happened, okay? The scene talks for itself, okay?
Is there any reason why they think I'm a suspect? I love my mom and dad.
What's going on?
I don't know what happened. I just came over to my parents' house because we were going to watch the game. And my mom is shot and my dad is shot and my brother's here.
Does anybody know what happened?
I don't know. I just know.
My mom and he shot himself. And then he shot my mom. My dad shot my mom. All right, have a seat in the car.
Officer,
Yes,
did my dad die?
I have no idea what's going on. The county units are going to come down here and they'll ask you questions, okay?
I don't have a record.
Okay.
How long is this gonna take?
One of the things that strikes me is the rapid nature of his shift of mood. So it kind of goes into what we call shallow affect, or the shallowness of the emotional expression.
This is bizarre. What this behavior is sussing out or exploring what do the police know so that he will then know what to expect and how to angle what he's going to do next.
Well, my dad's the pastor at the church of the church right near here. Lord, please don't let my dad die. Please don't let my dad die, Lord. Please don't let my dad die. Please, Lord, don't let my dad die.
Daniel's appeal to God can be seen as kind of an attempt to be seen positively. If people view him as a spiritual religious figure, they might be more forgiving of his sins. It's an attempt at manipulation.
This is a continuation of the performance. He's really quite sharp about what he's doing. I think it could be a genuine expression of hope that maybe his dad doesn't die, but I don't think so.
First one is Daniel. How about your date of birth?
I'm 16.
What grade are you in?
I'm a junior.
And whose house were you headed over to when you got stopped?
I called my friend Steve and told him what happened.
What did you tell Steve happened?
That my dad had shot my mom and then shot himself. And he thought I was joking at first, just kind of laughed about it, but then I told him I was serious and it wasn't a joke. And he told me he'd meet up with me.
When your sister came to the door. What happened then?
She came to the door, and I opened the door, and I was standing there, and she asked me what was wrong. And I didn't want her to see it. And she walked in and saw it and started screaming. Can I call my sister? Am I allowed to call my sister and see how my dad's doing? We'll see.
Anybody touch the gun?
I picked up the gun.
You picked up the gun?
And set it over on the other chair. And I realized that he wasn't dead and he might try and do something to himself again. So I moved him.
What he's doing here is very calculated. He is providing a reason that might explain why his fingerprints will be found on the gun. And he makes it even sound like it was a gesture of kindness. But no, he's plotting an alibi.
I've been against bowling tonight. No.
What about, do you think they'll go to those years? You Boston? Don't think they ever did.
It's just this absolute indifference to the whole situation he's in. He is entirely self-absorbed, and there's no emotional involvement in this tragedy he's supposed to be experiencing. There's a couple of things you can make of his comment about sports. One is there's a complete mismatch between the tone and the nature of the question and the emotional situation he's supposed to be in. There at the police station, he's a suspect. Parents may be both dead. He's not really sure. And then he asks this question that's completely off topic about sports and wants to know where the detective is coming from on his affiliation with sports. And it does produce a darkly comic effect because it's out of the blue. It defies our own expectations if we're normal about what should be on his mind at this point. And I actually think that was probably just a random thought. He's moved on to what was in the news, what was in sports. Something that's of interest to him, his lack of empathy, frees him from being distressed, really, about his mom and his dad's condition. And he's free to let his mind wander on to other topics that are of interest to him.
You said you had been grounded. How long have you been grounded for?
A month.
That's good. You snuck out of the house.
Mm-hmm.
Where'd you guys go?
We went up to the mall. There was a new game coming out.
Is that your Halo game in the van?
It's like an alien invasion game. It was being released at midnight, and we're being there to get the game at midnight.
When did your parents find out that you had snuck out to go get this game?
I came back in the house and I was playing in the basement, and my mom woke up and came down there. Yeah, it was probably 1:30 in the morning. She knew it was coming out at midnight. She woke my dad up and they just said I was grounded and that I was just gonna be grounded for a while until they said I was ungrounded. My parents just said they were disappointed in me that I would do something like that.
The video game is not what's significant. What's significant is his parents, in his perception, are intentionally and motivated to prevent him from reaching a goal. And that is what increases the level of anger and subsequent aggression.
The video game is definitely a fantasy world. This is absorbing to him. This is his world. Invasion narratives are about the other that's coming in either to threaten or take over something, and you get to fight back and ward them off and overcome and win. So this is about power.
I had asked them if I could go out to the movies with a friend tonight. That's why my parents were arguing. So I was sitting in my room, and then my dad was just yelling, just screaming at my mom. And then I heard a gunshot.
How would you do that?
So I ran out there, and my mom had been shot. He pointed the gun at me. Then he said he was sorry, and then he shot himself.
I don't buy it at all. This is the story he's decided he's going to tell. He's trying to sound emotionally upset, well, kind of half covering his face for it. But what the dynamic he's setting up is that he is a victim in all of this. We see him attributing to the father his own aggression and blaming the father because he resents his father. I think the emotion and the story are absolutely calculated. This is his alibi.
Is there any reason why they think I'm a suspect? Probably because I got in the car and left. I hope my dad's all right. The only thing is, my dad's all right, he's gonna go to jail.
Is there anything you want to tell me? I mean, we all know what happened, okay? The scene talks for itself, okay? So we know what happened. I don't know why it happened. That's what I'm trying to find out now, is why it happened.
No, I don't feel like talking. I just need to gather my thoughts for a second. You know, like, basically, like what kind of sentencing has been dealt out?
Well,
like what I'm looking at?
yes. What do you think should be a suitable punishment?
I don't know. Will I be charged as an adult?
I can't say, because that's not up to me right now, all right?
Because I am a juvenile.
His change in body language is very interesting. He has his left hand toward his brow to indicate that he's crying, looking with his left eye to see what the detective is doing.
There's the element of psychopathy. Someone who apparently doesn't really have empathy. It looks like he is angling and conniving and planning and checking out what he needs to say and what he won't say so he can figure out what will be best for him.
You getting paid overtime for this? Not till 11. Do you usually work this late? Like, what are your hours? 3 to 11. 3 p.m. to 11. Those are good hours. Single life. You get to stay up late and sleep in. It's good hours. Oh my gosh.
So people who are psychopaths, they can put on a mask and appear as normal as possible to other people. He doesn't care about the police officers, but he is probing. What's clear, no matter what we read into his specific comments, is that he is not behaving like a normal person. He's not having the basic emotions of fear, anxiety, loss, and concern about family.
So, did you get the gun out of the top of the dresser?
I just don't feel like talking.
Do you know who got shot first?
It's almost kind of like I blacked out for a minute.
Do you remember how many times you shot the gun? Do you remember where your dad was at when you shot the gun?
Honestly, not really. I don't remember much.
When you say not really, what do you remember of that?
It's just that I get real angry. And it's kind of just, I don't really know.
Okay.
It wasn't something I really thought about.
Mr. Pinker, you shoot your wife. No. Mr. Pinker, you cannot shoot. Was there an argument earlier that day between the three of you? Did Daniel do this to you, Susan? Mark, I want to thank you for your time. You're a strong person.
Well, at this point right now, it's going to be murder. Okay? So why don't you go ahead and tell me now? What happened? Let's just be done with this. Get it out. And let me tell your side of it.
My parents were arguing, and eventually it came down to, they said they were going to get a divorce. I just kind of snapped.
He's trying to think of reasons. I've spun the religious reason. I've spun the I don't know what happened reason. I've spun my father did this reason. I think we're on the 6th different narrative at this point. But he did not snap. The literature and the science has been very, very clear that people don't snap. If you scratch below the surface in many of these instances, there are many clues. Long-term anger, possible depression, inconsistency within parents, high control, low empathy. There's always signs.
Reverend Mark Petrick takes the stand in a trial of his 17-year-old son, Daniel. Prosecutors say in October of last year, the teenager shot his father and shot and killed his mother, Sue Petrick, in the living room of their Wellington home.
He said, "Would you guys close your eyes? I have a surprise for you."
The line that the father tells us, I think there is an element of sadistic pleasure in doing it. It does come within the context of an adolescent who, I suspect for a while, has felt enraged living in the home under the rules from the parents.
Mark Petrick of Wellington believes his son's addiction to a violent video game is what caused him to shoot both his parents after they took the game away.
He got involved in the violent graphic video games and became addicted to them and was playing as much as 18 hours a day.
He decided to kill both of them and to make it look like a murder-suicide. Daniel has serious problems telling the truth. Daniel knows how to manipulate. His brain really works.
If you're growing up in a household where you realize the rules are very strict, it can produce a sort of split sense in kids growing up. Some children may discover they have to be duplicitous. You have to be able to say yes to get along with everybody, because those are the rules, while then secretly doing something else. Where this can then move into the psychopathy range is that they can develop a genuine lack of empathy for the people they have to live around but can no longer relate to. being involved in the gaming meant something very important to him emotionally in the fantasy he could engage in.
The video game in and of itself is not the causative factor to a homicide. However, it feeds the fantasy that this violence is actually a feasible and reasonable solution to my grievance.
I thought it's for a rag. Right. We have an officer out and about in the car, and we'll send him your way. Can you give me your name? Amanda. Amanda Gordon. And Amanda, have you talked to anyone else in the other vehicle? Yeah.
Thursday, 2:19 a.m.
This is the Stratford Police Department calling for Amanda Morton. We found your vehicle and couldn't find you. Give us a call. Thank you.
Minutes before she was kidnapped, Morton used a cell phone to report someone had just rear-ended her. Police found her car running, her purse inside, but they did not find Morton.
She's wanting to know what the hell we're gonna do. I mean, common sense would tell you, here's this guy, and he's got you pulled up in front of a damn cemetery, and walking you through the damn woods back here. What do you think's gonna happen next? I'm just gonna take her out there and kill her.
Amanda's family contacted news media Thursday morning and gave them Amanda's picture. Investigators got their break when a motel owner in Camden County saw her picture on the 5 o'clock news and called police. He said Amanda and a man in a pickup checked into his motel. That led police to St. Clair County, to the home of David Zink.
How did you meet her again?
So, we had a wreck.
She run into you?
No, I hit her. She was worried that she was going to get in trouble. I was worried that I was going to get in trouble. I knew that I was drunk. What was in my mind was not to go back to jail. And I figured, well, drunk, driving, DUI, parole violation, 13 years. Nah, I ain't gonna do it.
You could have let her go home because you had to make your parole.
Right.
Because if you didn't make that meeting, what would happen?
Well, it's another violation. I started to look kind of bad about that. Now we're in a position where my ass is in trouble. Since it's in trouble, you're gonna pay too. I actually kind of told her to get in the truck, so she didn't really have much of a choice in that matter.
He can play the easygoing nice guy. He uses that kind of calm, cool persona to move his plans along and seems to do so with pretty good success.
Amanda just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I have no doubt that he lulled her into going with him because he was charming. We as humans are socialized to believe that people who are humorous are likable and people who are likable are trustworthy. So it's a really unfortunate reality that he was able to exploit as a psychopath that assumption we make as humans.
He is not perceiving people as other human beings. He's seeing them as objects, in this case, that are in his way. To me, the Zink case is all about self-preservation. He's gonna do whatever it takes to preserve himself being out of prison.
Once we got in the truck, then it was cool. We just took off. I had $1 million bill in my pocket, which was fake. She didn't know the damn difference. I gave it to her, and it was like, oh man, like, I told her I was a bank robber, but I ain't no bank robber. And she was like highly impressed with $1 million bill. It wasn't real.
He's taking some pleasure describing how gullible she was from his perspective. It was amusing to him that he could take out of his pocket a fake $1 million bill and con this young woman into believing it was real.
In all likelihood, she knew that there was not $1 million bill, and if there was, he didn't have it, but she went along with his story. What is she gonna do? She's going to say, wow, you have $1 million bill. That's clearly what he wants to give off. And it seems like she was probably very smart in trying to play into that. The victim here really was trying to survive.
They're both tired. I pulled into this motel and I went into the office to register. She came in. Guy tells me he wants $50 for the room. I told him I was trying to rent the room, not buy it.
Assuming this did actually happen, it gives you the sense that he was not in any way afraid. He was not in any way unsure about what he was doing. He was making jokes with the cashier.
He's self-assured. He keeps his cool. He's got the persona down pat of being, like a good old boy, and everything is under control, and that is spooky. She's in the office with him, which I find more incredible. Like, here's this girl, and she doesn't flip out and say, call the police. So she obviously, on some level, must have trusted him or didn't see him as a threat. This just really illustrates how he manipulated her, or, lied to her.
Little did she know, he was a killer. Zink kidnapped her, took her to a motel near Camdenton where he raped her.
Do you have any kind of sexual relationship with her?
I'm not going to say yes or no on that, because then you'll try to make it into a sex thing, and it wasn't that.
Okay.
That's what the TV's tried to make us into, a sexual thing, and it wasn't that at all. It was, in fact, an accident. And because of my previous criminal history, they're going to make this out to be a sex-driven crime. It wasn't that to start with.
He's a psychopath who is lying his way through this portion of the interrogation. Zink's DNA was found on Amanda's body. There is no doubt that there was some sort of sexual interaction.
It's a little odd. Killing someone's okay, but don't think about me as a rapist. There are a lot of crimes you can commit that wind you up in jail, but sex crimes are seen as sort of the low man on the totem pole, because sex crimes make you a target in jail. If you're a rapist, everyone will say, well, I have a sister or a wife or a mother, so you're a piece of garbage. And if it's a kid, forget it. They emerge in prison, at least, as likely targets for sexual abuse themselves, and they just want to be seen that way.
After you left the motel, where'd you go?
It was kind of a weird situation. Amanda started, well, you got to take me home. I told her, well, we have to go to the parole officer before we go doing anything else. That wasn't sitting real well with her. She's wanting to know what the hell we're going to do. But I know that by this time that I'm going to have to eliminate her, because she knows my name.
Zink has a strange disconnect in his thought process right now, because on the one hand, he's saying he has no intention of going back to an incarcerated life. But on the other hand, he's sort of giving into the simplest, most obvious solution, which is also the most ridiculous, the most antisocial, and the most violent. But for Zink, it isn't as much of a leap. He has a problem to solve, and this is a logical solution.
If I think that you're going to pose a threat to my freedom, it's set in my mind that I will eliminate you.
So you're set on self-preservation.
I guess you could use those words. It ain't exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking my ass ain't going back to the joint.
Zink underwent psychological evaluations as part of his court cases, and they really give you a sense of how his psychopathy manifested from an early age. The report reads, Zink was afraid of his mother, who suffered from depression and was impatient, nervous, and irritable. She was very harsh with him and often yelled at him, grabbed him, and talked down to him. She provided little guidance or discipline. She would get drunk a lot and would get angry. Zink hid from her. And here's what Zink says about his father. The same report reads, When Zink was 4, his father was involuntarily committed to a mental hospital for several months. His father often talked of suicide or engaged in suicidal behaviors, even in front of Zink and his 2 sisters. Zink saw his father take a gun and threaten to shoot himself. I don't think they're necessarily modeling psychopathy here, but they are modeling violent behavior. So he has whatever genetics are there. He has this upbringing where he's neglected. This is the recipe for psychopathy here.
If you're talking nature versus nurture, I really do think that, there is some temperament that you're born with. For example, if you're a high risk taker and you're fearless, maybe you become a firefighter. Or, depending on the environment you grow up in, you become a bully, or you become someone that engages in criminal behavior. But the environment will lead you down a path to acting that temperament out in some fashion. We know he's a risk taker. So if you grow up in a house where there is violence, it does set the tone, perhaps, for becoming the kind of person he became.
We'll go all the way up to the church, where the cemetery sits there. I'm just gonna take her out there and kill her.
She saying anything to you?
Yeah, she's wanting to know what the hell we're gonna do. I mean, common sense would tell you, here's this guy, and he's got you pulled up in front of a damn cemetery, walking you through the damn woods back here. What do you think's gonna happen next? It's pretty simple.
There's some amusement he takes in the fact that she's not getting it. She's essentially being escorted to her death. He's not telling her the truth about what's going to happen. It's all sadistic, but he doesn't want her to panic, so he's staying cool.
To him, it's extremely logical that she should be using common sense at this point, when nothing about this invokes the idea of common sense. To Zink, all of these pieces do connect in a very cohesive way, but they don't. It's part of the narcissistic tendency to feel like you have everything under control and figured out.
About 6 hours later at 4 in the morning, investigators recovered Amanda's body from a shallow grave in this cemetery.
She'd been strangled and stabbed.
You have a rope with you, or you find one laying around?
It was like baling twine. I just stuck it in my pocket and said, let's go this way. Then I took her down that little path, got down in there and told her, okay. I tied her hands behind her back and then tied her to the tree.
Okay. And then you had this other rope about 10 foot long. Put that around her neck?
Yeah. I was just holding it, one wrapped around her neck.
Okay, you just like made a loop and then held it.
And then I told her, well, I'm gonna have to kill you. She says, why? I said, I laid it on my name. So I told her to look up. She said, up where? I said, up there. When she looked up, I broke her neck.
Okay. How did you do that?
Just snapped her with your hands, yeah.
His description of the murder is highly sanitized. The fact that they found dirt in her mouth or seminal fluid in her anus suggests that there was a deeper level of psychopathology taking place than he cared to discuss.
In looking at the court records and psychological evaluations that were available on Zink, here's an excerpt that gives us some of that information. By the time he was 10, Zink was placed in foster care. Within a few weeks, Zink ran away. Around that time, his foster mother found him making a noose out of a rope. He had an emerging obsession and fixation or focus on strangulation from a very, very young age. Clearly, there was a willingness to start to skirt the idea of death, the idea of violence, the idea of strangulation.
The fact that he had rope in his car, I don't know if that's just a coincidence. You don't have to tie a dead body to a tree, but you do have to tie a live body to a tree so that they can't struggle. It raises, I guess, deeper concerns about how savage he really is.
Before she died, and you had her out there at the cemetery and tied her up, had she said anything or,
What was her last words?
Yeah.
We'll never know if those were actually her last words, but in one way or another, he wanted you to know that there's some connection with his mom in why he's doing this too. The connections between Zink and his mom were really apparent in the court records as well. The court records say, although the foster family wanted to adopt him, he always fantasized about going back home. At age 14, Zink asked to move home, but his mother refused, devastating him. The thing that really pops out to me here is this element of maternal rejection, which in the psychopathy literature is very prominent. And this is not an everyday maternal rejection. This is, mom gave him up, but it is not inevitable that anyone who's rejected by their mother is going to be a psychopath. It is one piece of the very, very complicated puzzle that goes into creating a psychopath. And it is not an excuse for what he turned into and what he did.
He's getting some joy from knowing that she called out for her mom and the mom wasn't there to help her or to save her. I do find myself wondering if that's him projecting a lot of his hatred toward his own mother and his own feelings that his own mother was inadequate and moms are inadequate. And if that also fueled some of his own hatred towards females.
Well, then she's still making a little noise, so I pulled the rope to tighten it around her neck so she couldn't make any noise. Finally, she collapsed on the rope that's holding her hands. I cut the twine loose from her hands, put the twine in my pocket, but she ain't acting dead enough for me yet. Nerves, what have you.
You do anything else?
No. Wasn't nothing to do but to get rid of her now. Well, then I drug her down to the place where I buried her. I knew that she had to be dead by now. I said, what if she revised? You know, I've heard people getting buried and coming, you know, thinking that they were dead. And so to make sure that she was going to remain that way, I just decided, well, I'll cut her spinal cord and the neck. You ain't gonna live through that.
This is the kind of statement that gives you this icky feeling that you just shouldn't be hearing something like this. We see that he was torturing her, he was beating her, he was playing with her as an object, and it takes it to a whole other level.
And unlike some other psychopaths, he doesn't really even make an attempt to pretend that he feels bad. He doesn't try to pretend that he has emotions or that he's even really bothered or disturbed by it.
What kind of knife are we looking at?
Pocket knife.
How did you bury her? What did you use?
Run over to the house, and I think my stepmom was inside, and I think I went inside and got some tea or something to drink. I don't think I talked to anybody at the time. My dad wasn't there. And I went out and got a shovel, threw it in the back of the truck, went back over to the cemetery. Then I threw a little bit of dirt over it.
He's not panicked. This is just a normal day, like it's no big deal. And that really, I think, sums up a lot of how Zink, as a psychopath, sees his crimes. He's just really not broken up by them.
One thing that's really notable from Zink's childhood is that he seemed to have a pretty severe case of meningitis. And the results of this PET scan were consistent with some of the brain abnormalities that we know about psychopaths in the literature. For example, he had less activation in the amygdala and the cingulate, both of which are very important areas in the brain involved in fear and emotional response. So the fact that these areas are underactivated in psychopaths and in Zink is not surprising. He is not afraid at all of the consequences.
What did you do with the shovel after you were done?
Cleaned it, oiled it, put it up.
Where'd you put it at?
Where I found it.
Is there anything else you want to add to it before we turn this thing off?
Nothing at this point.
After his arrest, Zink exchanged letters with a local TV news journalist. Here are some excerpts from it. I've secretly always wanted to be a serial killer. Your preconceived idea that this is a crime motivated by some type of sexual perversion. You don't even come close. There's no sex in the world that can give you a pleasure of taking a life. Watching their eyes and knowing that I have the power to give or take that life. I hope that you would just put this letter in the trash. Nothing good can come from selling death. Have a good day, David Zink. It's almost his manifesto in a way. He wants to control the narrative and say, hey, put me on TV, and this is the story I want you to tell.
But you heard none of that kind of talk during his interview. Nothing even remotely like that. He's kind of a liar, and he's playing games to sidestep the whole notion that he's driven by perverse, violent sexual fantasies.
There seem to be a multitude of risk factors here, where he has these biological.
It begins with a sound that never made the evening news, the low mechanical hum of a streetlight flickering back on just before dawn, casting a sickly yellow circle onto wet pavement in eastern Berlin, a place still learning how to breathe after reunification. Where old borders had vanished but fear hadn't, where memory clung to brick and concrete like smoke, and on that morning in October 1993, the city woke up without knowing that something had already gone terribly, irrevocably wrong. A woman did not come home. No scream was reported. No neighbors heard a struggle. No alarm shattered the quiet. Just absence, sudden and sharp, like a sentence cut off mid-word. Her name was Claudia Weiss, 32 years old, an archivist by training, meticulous, predictable, the kind of person who folded receipts and returned library books early, the kind of person whose disappearance did not fit any known pattern, and that, investigators would later say, was the first thing that frightened them. Her apartment was untouched. The bed was made. The kettle was cold. Her coat still hung by the door, which suggested she never intended to be out long. Maybe a short walk, a cigarette, a late errand, something mundane enough not to register as danger, and in 1993 Berlin was full of mundane dangers hiding in plain sight, half-lit streets, abandoned factories. Transient populations drifting between the cracks of a city still stitching itself together. The last confirmed sighting came from a tram driver who remembered her only because she smiled, an odd detail to cling to, but that's what happens when everything else is gone. She stepped off near Lichtenberg just after 9 p.m., disappeared into the dark, and then there was nothing, no credit card activity, no phone calls, no letters, no body, just a growing silence that settled over her family and the neighborhood like ash. Police initially treated it as a voluntary disappearance. That word, voluntary, would later feel obscene. Adults disappear, officers said. People start new lives. But Claudia had left behind her passport, her savings, her mother's birthday gift still wrapped on the kitchen table, and the community felt it immediately. That low, animal sense that this was not a choice, that something had been taken. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Posters faded on brick walls already layered with old propaganda and new advertisements. Tips came in, then slowed, then stopped. The case file thickened, not with answers, but with unanswered questions, pages of dead ends, names crossed out, addresses that led nowhere, and Berlin kept moving, always moving, while one family stayed frozen in time. By the mid-90s, the term cold case began to surface in internal memos, spoken quietly, reluctantly, like a diagnosis no one wanted to give. Detectives rotated out. New faces skimmed old notes, each one convinced, briefly, that they would see what the others had missed. Each one eventually staring at the same photographs, the same maps, the same gaps. There were rumors. Always rumors. A man seen arguing with a woman near the tram stop. A van parked too long by the canal. A scream that might have been laughter. A construction site where something could have been buried before the concrete dried. Every rumor carried urgency, then collapsed under scrutiny, leaving behind only exhaustion and the creeping suspicion that the truth, whatever it was, had been swallowed by the city itself. Berlin in the 90s was a place of shadows and reinvention. Files went missing. Jurisdictions overlapped. East and West police cultures clashed quietly in offices that still smelled of old cigarettes and stale coffee. Records were incomplete. Trust was fragile. And somewhere in that chaos, if there was a crime, it hid well. Claudia's mother called every week for the first year. Then every month. Then only on anniversaries. Her voice changed over time, detectives noted, less pleading, more hollow, as if hope itself had been worn down by repetition. Friends moved away. The apartment was eventually emptied. Life, relentlessly, continued. By 2003, the case was officially classified as a cold case. The words looked clinical on paper, but they landed like a verdict. Unsolved. Inactive. Archived. A human life reduced to a box number on a shelf in a building no one visited unless they were lost, bored, or haunted. And yet, the file never truly slept. In 2010, a junior analyst digitizing old records flagged inconsistencies in the original timeline, small things, the timestamp on a tram log, a witness statement taken days later than recorded. Nothing explosive, nothing actionable, but enough to reopen internal discussions. Enough to remind the department that unresolved cases have a way of lingering, like a bad smell that no amount of fresh paint can hide. Still, nothing moved. No new leads. No new bodies. The city changed again. Glass replaced concrete. Tech startups moved into buildings that once held secrets. Claudia Weiss became a name known only to those who had loved her and to a handful of detectives who never quite let go. Until the call. It came in on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, decades after that night, routed through the anonymous tip line, recorded automatically, stripped of identity before anyone even listened to the message, a voice distorted by fear or age or both, calm but urgent, speaking in short, deliberate sentences, naming a place, a person, and a detail that had never been released to the public. That detail changed everything. Within hours, supervisors were pulled into offices. The old file was retrieved, dusted off, laid open on a conference table under fluorescent lights that buzzed too loudly. The tip was cross-referenced. The name mentioned had been interviewed once, briefly, in 1993, dismissed due to lack of evidence, a footnote in a footnote, and now, suddenly, that footnote was glowing. The location named had been redeveloped twice since the 90s, but old maps still existed. Old permits. Old photographs. And buried in those records was a gap, a window of time unaccounted for, a week where no inspections occurred, where something could have happened unseen. The mood inside the department shifted, not to celebration, but to something sharper, more dangerous. Cautious belief. Cold cases break hearts as often as they break open. Everyone knew that. Everyone moved carefully, as if the truth might bolt if startled. Surveillance began quietly. The man named in the tip was older now, heavier, slower, living an unremarkable life that blended seamlessly into the city. No criminal record of note. No obvious red flags. A neighbor who waved. A citizen who paid taxes. Exactly the kind of person no one looks at twice. And yet, detectives watched. They listened. They waited. When the arrest finally came, it was sudden, deliberate, almost clinical. No sirens. No cameras. Just officers at a door, a name spoken aloud, handcuffs clicking shut in a hallway that smelled faintly of detergent and old wood. Word spread fast anyway. It always does. Berlin reeled. Headlines exploded across screens. A 1993 disappearance, a cold case, an anonymous tip, an arrest after decades of silence. Shock rippled through communities that hadn't known they were connected to the story until now. Old neighbors called each other. Journalists dug up photographs. Armchair detectives flooded forums with theories, timelines, outrage. But beneath the noise, the questions multiplied. Why now? Why this tip? Why this man? And where, after all these years, was Claudia Weiss? The arrest answered nothing. It only reopened wounds that had never healed, dragged a half-forgotten nightmare back into the light, and reminded a city that some stories do not stay buried just because time passes. Somewhere, someone had known something for a very long time. And now, the silence was finally cracking. The silence after the arrest was louder than any siren, a vacuum that pulled speculation into it, because an arrest without answers is not closure, it's an invitation, and Berlin accepted it with a mix of hunger and dread as details began to leak in fragments, incomplete and sharp-edged. Each one cutting a little deeper into a past everyone thought was sealed. The man in custody was named Marcus Keller, 61 years old, a former electrical technician who had lived through the fall of the wall and somehow remained invisible on both sides of history, the kind of life that leaves very little trace. And investigators quickly realized that this invisibility was not accidental but practiced, refined over decades of blending in, of being forgettable by design. In 1993, Keller was 31. Newly unemployed after the closure of a state-run factory, drifting through a city flooded with displaced men and sudden freedoms, a demographic that would later be described in internal reports as statistically unremarkable and therefore dangerously overlooked. Back then, Keller lived less than a kilometer from where Claudia Weiss was last seen. That fact had been noted, circled once in red pen, then abandoned when nothing concrete emerged, no witnesses, no forensic link, no motive strong enough to survive scrutiny. He had an alibi that night, a coworker who claimed they drank together until late, a statement given casually, accepted quickly, never deeply tested, because in 1993 Berlin, speed mattered more than precision, and cases piled up faster than they could be handled. Now, decades later, that alibi was a liability. The coworker was dead. The bar had closed years ago. The street had been renamed. But paper remembers. Old employment records showed Keller had been dismissed weeks earlier than he claimed. Phone logs contradicted his timeline. Small fractures appeared in the story, invisible in the 90s, glaring now under modern scrutiny, and detectives began to feel that old, dangerous sensation again, the sense that they were standing on the edge of something vast and unstable. Inside the interrogation room, Keller said little. He listened. He blinked slowly. He asked for water. When shown Claudia's photograph, he didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't acknowledge recognition or deny it outright, a reaction that unsettled even the most seasoned officers, because guilt often hides in extremes, and Keller gave them none. The anonymous tip, still sealed, became the axis around which everything turned. Only a handful of people knew its contents in full. What leaked to the press was sanitized, vague, references to non-public information and specific knowledge of the scene, phrases designed to reassure without revealing, but among investigators, the weight of that tip was crushing. It mentioned a smell, a sound, and an object Claudia owned that had never been documented anywhere outside her apartment. That object had been missing since 1993. Search warrants followed. Keller's apartment was combed inch by inch. Nothing obvious surfaced. No souvenirs. No photographs. No hidden rooms. But the absence itself was telling, too clean, too intentional, as if someone had learned, over many years, exactly how much of a past could be erased without raising suspicion. Attention shifted to the location named in the tip, an old industrial lot near the Spree, now partially redeveloped into office space and cafes, the kind of place where people drank espresso over foundations poured on secrets. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed at night, discreetly, because the optics of digging up half the city for a 30-year-old case were politically volatile, and when the scans came back, they showed anomalies, irregularities beneath layers of concrete laid during a renovation in 1994. Not proof. Not yet. But enough. Construction permits from the early 90s were reviewed, and Keller's name appeared again, quietly, on a subcontractor list, a brief job, a temporary assignment, forgotten by everyone except the ledger. The timeline narrowed. A window of 3 days emerged, days when Claudia was already missing, days when Keller had access, tools, and privacy, and for the first time, the abstract horror of the case began to solidify into something tangible. The community reacted in waves. Some were furious, demanding to know how a suspect like Keller had slipped through decades ago. Others were cautious, warning against certainty, reminding anyone who would listen that arrests are not verdicts, that cold cases are fragile things, prone to collapse under the weight of expectation. Claudia's family said nothing publicly at first. Silence had become their language. As Keller remained in custody, his past was dissected. Former neighbors remembered him as quiet. Former colleagues described him as precise, almost rigid, someone who hated disorder, who noticed details others ignored. A former girlfriend came forward, reluctantly, describing a relationship that ended abruptly in mid-90s, marked by controlling behavior, unexplained absences, a temper that never quite exploded but simmered constantly under the surface. Still, no confession came. Prosecutors faced a familiar nightmare: how to prove a murder without a body, without a crime scene preserved in time, without witnesses willing to swear under oath after decades of erosion. The case hinged on circumstantial threads, each one thin, each one dangerous to pull too hard. Defense attorneys circled, already shaping narratives about hysteria, about unreliable memories, about a city projecting its unresolved guilt onto one man. And then another complication surfaced. A journalist, digging through old Stasi-era records for an unrelated story, stumbled across a reference to Claudia Weiss's name in a surveillance index dated 1989. She had been loosely monitored due to her archival work and family connections in the East. The file was thin, mostly banal observations, but it reignited a long-dormant theory: that Claudia's disappearance might have intersected with forces far larger than one man, that she might have known something, seen something, stumbled into a legacy of secrecy that outlived the regime itself. Investigators dismissed the idea publicly, but privately, it unsettled them. Cold cases thrive on doubt, and doubt was now multiplying faster than answers. The anonymous tipster remained silent. No follow-up calls. No demands. No attempt to claim credit. That silence felt intentional, almost disciplined, as if the person on the other end knew exactly how much to say and when to disappear again. The question hung in the air: why speak now, after all these years, and why stop there? As weeks passed, pressure mounted. Keller's lawyers pushed for release, citing lack of physical evidence. Prosecutors stalled, waiting on forensic tests from core samples taken at the redevelopment site, tests that could take months. Every delay fed speculation, every leak hardened opinions, and the city found itself once again living with Claudia Weiss, her face on screens, her name in headlines, a ghost resurrected by procedure. At night, detectives reread the file, the old notes written in different inks by hands long retired or dead. They noticed things they hadn't before: patterns in witness statements, recurring locations, a subtle narrowing of Claudia's last known movements that pointed, again and again, toward that stretch of river, toward that window of time, toward a man who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of being unnoticed. The case was no longer cold. It was volatile, unstable, threatening to explode or evaporate at any moment, and everyone involved knew that whatever came next would not bring simple answers, only another layer of truth, heavy and irreversible, waiting just beneath the surface, where Berlin had been walking all along. The waiting became its own kind of torment because once a cold case breaks, time stops behaving normally. Days stretch, hours compress, and every minor development feels seismic, especially when the truth is still buried somewhere under layers of concrete, memory, and deliberate forgetting. Berlin watched, held its breath, and inside police headquarters, the atmosphere thickened with the kind of pressure that turns routine decisions into moral ones. Forensic teams worked the industrial site in shifts, drilling narrow cores through concrete poured when the city was still learning how to call itself whole again. Each sample was cataloged, sealed, sent off to labs where technicians searched for microscopic traces of organic matter, fibers, anything that could anchor speculation to fact. It was slow, painfully slow, and in that slowness, doubts crept in. What if the anonymous tip was wrong? What if it was a misdirection, a confession shaped by guilt rather than truth? Cold cases are magnets for false certainty, and everyone involved knew how easily hope could curdle into humiliation. Marcus Keller remained in custody, calm to the point of irritation. He complained about the lights, about the food, about the length of the interviews. He never asked about Claudia Weiss. Not once. That absence gnawed at investigators more than any denial could have. When pressed, he fell back on procedural language, insisting on lawyers, on breaks, on the limits of memory. 30 years is a long time, he said.
People forget things.
People remember things wrong. It was a reasonable argument.
It was also terrifying.
As pressure mounted, prosecutors authorized a deeper dive into Keller's movements during the weeks after Claudia disappeared. Bank records were incomplete, cash-heavy, typical of the era, but patterns emerged. Withdrawals clustered around specific dates. Purchases of cleaning supplies. A rented storage unit paid for in cash, used briefly, then abandoned. When officers finally tracked it down, it was empty, scrubbed, repurposed twice over. But something about its location, its proximity to the spree, tightened the knot in everyone's chest. Witnesses from that period were hunted down like ghosts. A former night watchman remembered seeing a man near the industrial lot after hours, loading something heavy into a van. He couldn't be sure of the date, or the face, or even the color of the vehicle. But he remembered the weight, the way the man moved slowly, deliberately, as if afraid of making noise. Memory is unreliable, defense attorneys reminded the court of public opinion, but memory also leaves impressions that don't fade, and this one stuck. The media turned relentless. Headlines evolved from shock to accusation, from curiosity to certainty. Keller's face became familiar, his past dissected by strangers who felt entitled to answers. Old classmates were interviewed. Distant relatives emerged, eager or horrified. And through it all, Claudia Weiss remained curiously abstract, reduced to a symbol, a catalyst, her actual voice still absent from the narrative built around her disappearance. Then came the first lab report. It wasn't definitive. It never is. But it indicated elevated levels of phosphates beneath one section of the site, consistent with human decomposition, consistent but not conclusive, the kind of result that changes everything internally while changing nothing legally. Prosecutors tightened their grip. Defense attorneys sharpened theirs. The judge extended Keller's detention, citing ongoing investigation, and for the first time, a crack appeared in Keller's composure. It was small,
a twitch of the jaw,
a hesitation before answering a question about the river. Enough for detectives to notice. Enough to push harder. They returned to the anonymous tip, replayed the recording, analyzed cadence, breath, pauses. Linguistic experts suggested the caller was male, older, possibly someone with technical training. The voice had been deliberately flattened, emotion drained, but one phrase stood out, a regional inflection tied not to Berlin, but to a town outside it, a place Keller had lived briefly in the late 80s. Coincidence, perhaps, or something else. The idea that the tipster might be connected to Keller, or even be Keller himself, began to circulate quietly. It wasn't unprecedented. Confession through distance. Guilt-seeking resolution without consequence. But there was a problem. The tip contained details Keller would have had no reason to believe were unknown to police. It was precise, surgical, almost as if someone had been watching the investigation from the outside for years, waiting for the right moment to intervene. Another theory surfaced, darker, more destabilizing. That Keller hadn't acted alone. Reviewing old witness statements with fresh eyes, detectives noticed recurring references to a second figure, vague, inconsistent, dismissed at the time as confusion. A shadow near the tram stop. Another set of footsteps. A voice, deeper, arguing in a language not immediately identifiable. In the chaos of post-reunification Berlin, foreign languages blurred together, and what couldn't be understood was often ignored. Phone records from a payphone near Claudia's route showed a call placed minutes after her last sighting, dialed to a number that no longer existed, registered to a prepaid line common among temporary workers. It had been written off in 1993 as noise. Now it felt deliberate. Claudia's archival work came back into focus. Colleagues recalled her being unsettled in the weeks before she vanished, distracted, cautious, as if carrying something she couldn't share. She had asked unusual questions about restricted collections, about documents that had never been fully transferred after the wall fell. Nothing illegal, nothing overt, just curiosity that brushed against sensitive history. The Stasi file resurfaced, expanded now with context. Claudia hadn't been important enough to silence, officials insisted. But importance is relative. Sometimes it's not about what someone knows, but what they might realize next. The thought lingered, corrosive. Keller was questioned again, this time about Claudia's work, about archives, about whether he'd ever met her professionally. He denied it flatly. Too flatly. Investigators noted the speed of his response, the lack of hesitation. Liars often prepare for the questions they expect. This one had been ready. Then, unexpectedly, Keller asked a question of his own. He wanted to know whether they had found her yet. It was the first time he'd acknowledged Claudia as a person rather than a case, and the room went quiet. The question was neutral on the surface, but layered beneath it was something else, impatience, perhaps, or fear that the ground beneath him was about to give way. Detectives deflected, pressed on, but the shift lingered like static in the air. Outside, Claudia's mother finally spoke. In a brief statement, she said only that she wanted the truth, whatever it was, and that she had learned not to confuse arrests with justice. It was a line that cut through the noise, a reminder that this story did not belong to the state or the press, but to a family that had lived with unanswered questions for 3 decades. As winter deepened, excavations expanded. More anomalies were detected. Still no remains. Still no finality. Each negative result was both a relief and a blow, pushing the narrative toward either catastrophic failure or a revelation too large to contain. Behind closed doors, investigators began to accept a hard truth. Even if Keller was responsible, even if the anonymous tip was accurate, the city itself might have destroyed the last physical traces long ago. Buildings rise. Rivers shift. Concrete hardens. And with every year that passes, the past becomes more theoretical, more dependent on fragile human memory. But memory, for all its flaws, has one dangerous quality. It doesn't disappear quietly. And somewhere in Berlin, someone else remembered something. Something they hadn't planned to remember. Something that was now pushing its way to the surface, threatening to reshape the story of 1993, not as a single act of violence, but as a convergence of fear, opportunity, and silence that had waited 30 years for the right crack to finally split open. The crack widened slowly, almost politely, the way old buildings give warning before they fail, and the first thing to fall away was the assumption that 1993 had been chaotic only by accident. As investigators pushed deeper, they began to see structure where they had once seen disorder, a pattern of omissions, delays, and overlooked intersections that no longer felt random when laid side by side under unforgiving light. A second name surfaced. It had been there all along, buried in ancillary paperwork, mentioned once in a margin, never elevated to suspect status because it didn't fit the dominant narrative of the time. His name was Rolf Hartmann, a logistics contractor who floated between short-term projects in the early 90s, the kind of man whose employment history looked like static, always present, never clear. He had worked briefly at the same industrial site near the Spree. He had owned a van. He had left Berlin abruptly in early 1994. In 1993, no one chased him. People left all the time. Berlin was shedding and absorbing bodies at a rate no database could track. Hartmann vanished into southern Germany, then into Austria, then off the grid entirely, leaving behind unpaid rent and a forwarding address that led nowhere. At the time, it meant nothing. Now, it meant everything. Phone records, incomplete but stubborn, showed contact between Hartmann and Keller in the weeks leading up to Claudia's disappearance. Short calls. Payphones. No content, only timing. Defense attorneys called it coincidence. Prosecutors called it alignment. Detectives called it a mistake they couldn't afford to make again. Keller, confronted with Hartmann's name, reacted for the first time with something unmistakably human. His shoulders stiffened. His breathing changed. He asked how they had found him. Not Hartman. Him. The question slipped out before his lawyer could stop it, and it hung in the room, heavy with implication. Investigators pressed gently, the way you do when you sense a structure about to collapse under its own weight. Keller retreated, reasserted his rights. But the damage was done. Something had shifted. The mask had cracked. Outside the interrogation room, teams fanned out across Europe. Old border logs were pulled. Vehicle registrations resurfaced. Hartman's trail was faint but not invisible, leading to a small town near Graz, then to a construction firm that dissolved in the early 2000s, then to nothing. No death certificate. No official disappearance. Just another man who had learned how to become unfindable. The anonymous tip took on new gravity. Replayed again, re-examined again, the phrasing suddenly sounded less like confession and more like correction, as if the caller wasn't admitting guilt, but setting the record straight, nudging the investigation toward a truth that had been misaligned for decades. The tip mentioned 2 sets of footsteps. 2 voices. One panicked. One calm. That detail had never been public. The industrial site yielded more anomalies, this time closer to the riverbank. Soil discoloration. A depression beneath layers of fill added during a hurried expansion project in 1995. Excavation began at dawn, behind temporary barriers, away from cameras, and as machines peeled back earth that hadn't seen daylight in 30 years, the mood among investigators turned grim. This wasn't optimism anymore. It was recognition. Nothing human emerged that day, or the next. But they found something else. A rusted metal object, partially embedded, consistent with a tool used in electrical work, corroded beyond usefulness, but familiar enough to trigger a wave of quiet recognition among those who handled it. Keller had owned one like it. Hartman, too. In 1993, it would have been unremarkable. In 2026, it felt like a message sent through time. Forensics could not definitively link it to a crime. No blood. No tissue. Just context, and context prosecutors knew was both powerful and fragile. Build too much on it, and the whole case collapses. Ignore it, and you lose the thread entirely. Meanwhile, the media narrative began to fracture. 2 suspects. Possible accomplice. Institutional failure. The story grew too large for simple outrage. It demanded accountability, not just from individuals, but from a system that had missed the convergence of these men, these places, these moments when intervention might have changed everything. Claudia Weiss's colleagues came forward again, this time with clearer memories. One recalled Claudia mentioning a man who asked too many questions about access protocols. Another remembered her being followed, casually, dismissively, the way women are taught to dismiss discomfort to survive daily life. These memories hadn't felt important in 1993. Now they landed like delayed explosions. The Stasi connection faded and sharpened at the same time, no longer a grand conspiracy, but a backdrop, a city conditioned to secrecy, to not asking questions, to assuming someone else was watching. In that environment, small acts of predation could thrive unnoticed, protected by collective fatigue. Keller's detention was extended again. His lawyers protested. His health declined, or so they claimed. Medical evaluations found nothing acute, but stress leaves marks that don't show up on scans, and Keller began to look like a man aging in fast forward, his confidence eroding, his composure fraying at the edges. Then, quietly, without announcement, Hartman's name appeared on an international watch list. No press release.
No headlines.
Just a line in a database that signaled intent. Someone somewhere noticed. A man matching Hartman's description was reported in northern Italy, working under a different name, older, heavier, careful. Authorities moved slowly, coordinating, verifying, unwilling to spook a ghost back into hiding. Days passed. Then weeks. The lead cooled. Again. Back in Berlin, prosecutors faced an impossible calculation. Proceed with Keller alone and risk acquittal. Wait for Hartman and risk losing Keller entirely. Every option carried failure embedded in it. And beneath all of it, Claudia Weiss remained missing. No grave. No final proof. Just a narrowing circle of men, places, and decisions that pointed inward, toward a truth that refused to present itself cleanly. The cold case had broken, yes. But now it was doing something far worse. It was unraveling. And as threads pulled loose, it became increasingly clear that whatever happened in 1993 was not a single moment of violence, but a sequence of choices, each one small enough to rationalize, each one large enough to destroy a life. Waiting patiently for 30 years until enough pressure built to force the past back into the present, where it could no longer be ignored. The unraveling didn't come all at once. It came in increments, each one subtle enough to deny until it stacked into something undeniable, like stress fractures spreading through concrete long before the collapse. By the time Part 5 began to take shape, investigators were no longer asking what happened in 1993. They were asking how many people had looked straight at it and turned away. The first internal reckoning came quietly. An audit of the original investigation revealed that several witness statements had been logged but never formally evaluated, a procedural gray zone common in the early post-reunification years, when departments were merged faster than protocols. One statement, taken from a sanitation worker, described discarded personal items found near the spree weeks after Claudia Weiss vanished: a scarf, a notebook, a broken chain. The items were bagged, photographed, then misfiled under an unrelated property crime. No follow-up, no cross-reference. No one could say why. The scarf was recovered from evidence storage, sealed and brittle with age. Claudia's mother identified it instantly. The pattern, the frayed edge she'd meant to fix. The room went silent. It was the first physical object undeniably tied to Claudia that had resurfaced in 3 decades, and it didn't answer any questions.
It only sharpened them.
Why there? Why discarded, not hidden? Why logged, then forgotten? Pressure mounted on the department. Politicians demanded explanations without committing to responsibility. Oversight committees formed and dissolved. The phrase systemic failure began appearing in headlines, a blunt instrument that flattened nuance but captured public anger perfectly. For the detectives still working the case, it felt like being buried alive under both history and expectation. Keller sensed the shift. He began talking more, not confessing, but narrating, offering long, meandering accounts of his life in the 90s, his frustrations, his sense of being overlooked in a city obsessed with reinvention. He framed himself as collateral damage of chaos, a man chewed up by history and spat out invisible. It was almost convincing. Almost. Then he mentioned Hartman again. Not by name, by habit. He referred to someone who drove. Someone who knew the river better. Someone who always cleaned up after himself. The language was casual, offhand, as if he were reminiscing about a colleague, not circling a crime. His lawyer objected. Detectives noted everything. The possibility of a joint act hardened into a working theory.
2 men.
Different roles. Different temperaments. One impulsive. One methodical. One visible. One designed to disappear. It explained too much to ignore. The gaps, the missteps, the way the case had seemed to slide sideways every time it approached clarity. In Austria, a breakthrough flickered, then dimmed. Financial records linked to a dormant account suggested Hartman had been alive as recently as 2018. Utility bills. A partial fingerprint on a rental application. Enough to prove existence. Not enough to prove location. The ghost was real. Still out of reach. Back in Berlin, forensic reanalysis of the scarf revealed trace fibers inconsistent with Claudia's apartment or clothing, industrial grade, used in packaging and transport. The fibers matched materials commonly used at the Spree redevelopment site in the mid-90s. It wasn't proof. It was alignment. Again. Media tone shifted from accusation to obsession. Timelines were reconstructed nightly. Experts argued over the meaning of silence, of delayed tips, of memory decay. Social media latched onto Keller's expressions, his pauses, his posture, dissecting him frame by frame. Truth became secondary to performance, and investigators worried the noise would contaminate the last witnesses still willing to speak. One of them finally did. A former bar owner, now living on the outskirts of Potsdam, contacted police after seeing Keller's face on television. In 1993, he said, 2 men drank heavily in his bar the night Claudia vanished. They argued. Not loudly, tightly. He remembered because one of them dropped a notebook and the woman at the bar picked it up, joked about people losing their lives in paper. The man had snapped at her, told her to mind her business. The notebook was returned. The woman laughed it off. The bar owner hadn't. The description matched Keller and Hartmann. He had never come forward before, because no one had asked. Not directly. Not clearly. Another omission. Another quiet failure. Prosecutors felt the window narrowing. Without Hartmann, without a body, the case balanced on circumstantial pillars that could crack under aggressive defense. Keller's attorneys filed motions to suppress, to dismiss, to delay. Each one bought time. Time favored no one. Claudia's mother declined interviews, but attended every hearing, small and rigid in the front row, a presence that reminded everyone that this wasn't an intellectual exercise or a historical correction. It was a life that had stopped without explanation, a grief that had been asked to wait politely for answers that never came. The anonymous tipster remained silent. That silence began to feel intentional again, not fear, not exhaustion, but satisfaction. The tip had done its job. It had broken the case open, forced movement, forced confrontation. Whoever made the call hadn't wanted credit. They had wanted motion. The question that haunted detectives was simple and unbearable. Why now? A theory emerged, fragile but persistent, that someone close to Hartmann, someone who had learned something late, had decided the weight of knowing was finally heavier than the risk of speaking. Deathbed confessions were romantic myths. Real ones were quieter.
Strategic.
Designed to protect the living while nudging the truth into daylight. As winter edged toward spring, excavation at the Spree reached bedrock. Nothing else was found. No remains. No definitive end. The river, patient and indifferent, had likely taken what it was given long ago. That realization settled heavily. Some endings are irreversible. Keller was indicted. The charges were careful, precise, built to survive absence. Unlawful detention, conspiracy, probable homicide. Language designed to hold without claiming what couldn't be proven. He pleaded not guilty.
Of course he did.
The city exhaled and inhaled again, bracing for a trial that promised no clean resolution, only layers of testimony, inference, and doubt. For some, the arrest had been enough. For others, it was a cruel half-measure. Closure, it turned out, was not a destination but a negotiation. And beneath it all, Claudia Weiss remained present in absence, her disappearance no longer a question mark but a gravity well, pulling in every oversight, every silence, every choice made in 1993 by people who believed the moment would pass, that history would smooth over what they couldn't face. It hadn't. It had waited. And now, with one suspect aging in a cell and another still drifting somewhere beyond reach, the case stood at its most dangerous point, not cold, not broken, but exposed, raw, and unresolved, demanding an answer that might never arrive, while reminding Berlin, relentlessly, that some truths do not surface to heal. They surface to accuse. The trial began without ceremony, no sweeping statements, no dramatic reveals, just the dull scrape of chairs and the rustle of paper as if the system itself were reluctant to draw attention to what it was about to do. Marcus Keller sat behind glass, thinner now, eyes set deep, watching a city finally look back at him, and for the first time since 1993, the disappearance of Claudia Weiss was no longer a rumor or a headline or a file number. It was a proceeding. A public reckoning conducted in careful language and legal restraint. Prosecutors opened with absence. No body.
No confession.
No single moment they could point to and say here. Instead, they built a narrative out of proximity and timing, out of habits and access, out of what Keller could not convincingly explain anymore. They spoke of the industrial site, of the river, of two men whose paths intersected too often to be coincidence. They spoke slowly, deliberately, aware that every word would be measured against the silence left behind by 30 years. The defense countered with erosion. Memory fades. Evidence decays. People project meaning onto patterns that never existed. Keller, they argued, was a convenient vessel for collective guilt, a man the city could punish for its own failures. They reminded the court that suspicion is not proof, that cold cases, once thawed, often reveal nothing but the hunger for resolution. Outside the courtroom, the public divided along familiar lines. Some wanted certainty, any certainty, enough to end the story. Others wanted restraint, afraid that the desire to fix the past would manufacture a truth that didn't exist. Claudia Weiss's name trended daily, attached to theories, timelines, accusations, while the woman herself remained frustratingly out of reach. Witnesses took the stand one by one. The bar owner, the former colleague, the analyst who found the misfiled evidence. Each testimony added texture, but not solidity, color but not form. The scarf was presented, sealed behind glass, its fabric faded but unmistakable. Claudia's mother didn't look at it. She stared straight ahead, jaw set, as if afraid that acknowledgement might turn the object into something final. Keller listened to it all with a posture that suggested endurance rather than defense. When he spoke, it was to deny specifics, to question assumptions, to insist on the ordinary nature of his past. He admitted knowing Hartman. He admitted working near the river. He admitted drinking too much in those years. He denied everything that mattered. Then came the recording. The anonymous tip was played for the court, the voice flattened and distant, the words stripped of context, but heavy with implication. Jurors leaned forward. Keller didn't move. Not until the phrase about the sound by the water, the detail that had never been public. His fingers tightened against the edge of the table. Just once. Just enough. The defense objected. The judge allowed it. For the first time, the case felt like it was tipping towards something irreversible, not a verdict, but a fracture in Keller's carefully maintained neutrality.
It was a small thing.
It might have meant nothing, but cold cases live in small things. They survive on them. Midway through the proceedings, a message arrived from Italy. Local authorities had detained a man for a routine documentation check near Verona. He gave a name that didn't hold up. His fingerprints, run through an international database flagged months earlier, returned a partial match.
Rolf Hartman.
Older.
Slower.
Still careful. The news was withheld from the jury.
For now.
But inside the prosecution team, it landed like an aftershock. Hartman was alive. In reach. The ghost had weighed again. Extradition discussions began immediately, tangled in bureaucracy and time. Hartman denied everything through an interpreter, claimed mistaken identity, insisted he had never been to Berlin after 1992. The lies were familiar. The difference was leverage. Keller was informed quietly, away from cameras, away from the court. His reaction was not explosive. It was worse. He closed his eyes, exhaled, and for a moment, the mask slipped entirely, revealing something close to relief. Or resignation. It was hard to tell. That night, for the first time since his arrest, Keller asked to speak without his lawyer. The request was denied.
Procedure is slow by design.
Justice does not sprint, even when truth threatens to outrun it. By the time Keller was permitted another interview, days had passed. Hartman remained in Italy. The trial continued, now vibrating with an unspoken tension that everyone felt but no one could acknowledge openly. When Keller finally spoke again, it wasn't a confession. It was a recalibration. He admitted that Claudia had been frightened, that she had known she was being watched, that she had confronted the wrong people at the wrong moment. He framed himself not as a perpetrator, but as a witness who failed to act, a man who saw danger and stepped aside. He did not say Hartman's name. He didn't have to. The statement fractured the courtroom. Prosecutors seized on it. Defense attorneys scrambled to contain it. The judge recessed early. Outside, reporters ran with fragments, headlines screaming about partial admissions, about cracks, about truth finally bleeding through. Inside the Weiss family, the statement landed differently. It confirmed fear without delivering resolution, knowledge without location, pain without end. Hartmann's extradition stalled. Appeals were filed. Time stretched again. The jury watched, listened, waited, tasked with deciding not what happened, but what could be proven, a burden as heavy as any verdict. And hanging over everything was the knowledge that even if Keller were convicted, even if Hartmann were brought back in chains, Claudia Weiss might never be found, her last moments forever inferred rather than known. As the trial pushed toward its final phase, one truth became unavoidable. The case had outgrown the courtroom. It was no longer about guilt alone.
It was about delay.
About silence. About how easily a life could vanish into administrative cracks wide enough to swallow it whole. Berlin had reopened the past. Now it had to decide what to do with what came out. The waiting returned, heavier this time, because now it carried faces, voices, contradictions spoken aloud under oath, and the longer the trial stretched on, the more it began to resemble the city itself, layered, incomplete, held together by assumptions that threatened to fail under pressure. Berlin listened, argued, judged, and inside the courtroom, the story of 1993 bent and warped as it passed through human memory, each retelling sharpening some edges while blunting others. Rolf Hartmann became a presence without being present. His name surfaced constantly, cautiously, framed as an unavailable co-conspirator, a legal phrase that felt inadequate for the gravity it carried. Jurors were instructed not to speculate. They did anyway. Everyone did. A second man always changes the math. It distributes guilt. It complicates motive. It offers the possibility that Keller's denials were not lies, but partial truths carefully rationed to survive. From Italy, Hartmann's lawyers leaked statements. He was ill. He was confused. He was a victim of mistaken identity. Each claim unraveled quickly under scrutiny, but the delays persisted, procedural molasses poured deliberately into the gears. Extradition hearings were scheduled, postponed, rescheduled. Time, once again, favored the man who had learned how to disappear. In Berlin, prosecutors made a decision that split their own team. They would proceed without Hartmann. The risk was enormous. But so was the alternative. A case stalled indefinitely is a case quietly buried, and too much had already surfaced to be pushed back under. They adjusted strategy, shifting focus from a single act to a shared trajectory, from proving murder to proving responsibility. They leaned into Keller's words. Witnesses returned to the stand, this time framed against Keller's admission that Claudia had been afraid. The question was no longer whether she had encountered danger, but whether Keller had helped create it, facilitate it, or allow it to unfold when intervention was possible. Complicity is harder to define than violence, but it is sometimes easier to recognize. A former colleague testified that Claudia had asked about unusual access logs days before she vanished. A friend described how Claudia had started varying her route home. A neighbor recalled her checking over her shoulder, laughing it off when asked. None of it proved anything on its own. Together, it painted a picture of a woman responding to pressure she didn't fully understand. The defense objected repeatedly. Speculation, character building, narrative overreach. The judge allowed more than expected, perhaps sensing that the case lived in accumulation, not revelation. Cold cases do not crack open. They seep. Keller watched the witnesses with a fixed intensity that unnerved even his own counsel. When the neighbor spoke about fear, his jaw tightened. When the colleague mentioned access logs, he shook his head slowly, as if correcting a memory that only he could see. Observers argued later about what it meant. Guilt, frustration, recognition. Projection filled the gaps where certainty refused to go. Midway through the week, a sealed document was introduced. It was an internal memo from 1994, unearthed during the audit, written by a junior officer who had since retired. The memo flagged Keller and Hartmann together, noted, possible coordination, and recommended further inquiry. It had been marked pending and never acted upon. The officer testified via video, older now, voice unsteady, apologizing without being asked. The courtroom absorbed the weight of that omission in silence. This was no longer just about two men. It was about a decision that hadn't been made, a door that hadn't been opened, a moment when inertia had triumphed over curiosity. The jury saw it. The city felt it. Even the defense softened, shifting from denial to mitigation, arguing that Keller had been a bystander to failures larger than himself. Then Hartmann's extradition finally cleared. The timing was cruel. 2 days before closing arguments. The judge faced an impossible choice. Delay everything. Fold Hartmann in. Risk mistrial. Or proceed, knowing the truth was arriving too late to be fully heard. After hours of deliberation, the decision came down. The trial would continue. Hartmann would be handled separately. Justice, the judge said, could not wait forever. Hartmann landed in Berlin under cover of night.
No cameras. No statements.
Just a man stepping onto the same ground he had fled 3 decades earlier. He was processed, questioned briefly, and placed in custody. His first question was not about charges or lawyers. He asked whether Keller had talked. The answer was partial. Hartmann said nothing else. News of his return detonated across the city. The narrative fractured again. Some saw confirmation. Others saw contamination. Had Keller been scapegoated? Had the trial moved too fast? Was the system correcting itself or compounding error with urgency? Inside the Weiss family, the return reopened wounds they had barely begun to process. Claudia's mother did not attend the day the news broke. She stayed home, later saying that she had learned the difference between information and understanding. Closing arguments came and went in a blur of language designed to crystallize chaos. Prosecutors spoke of responsibilities shared across silence. Defense attorneys spoke of doubt, of the danger of punishing proximity instead of proof. Keller declined to speak. Hartmann remained a shadow behind frosted glass in another building, another process, another delay. The jury deliberated longer than expected. Outside, Berlin waited again, older now, more self-aware, less confident that verdicts could do what time had failed to do. The cold case had broken.
Yes.
But what it revealed was not a clean truth, but a mirror, reflecting how easily uncertainty can be mistaken for safety, how often silence is allowed to stand in for innocence. Whatever the jury decided, one thing had already become clear. The disappearance of Claudia Weiss was no longer just an unsolved crime. It was an indictment of everything that had allowed it to remain that way for so long. The verdict did not arrive like a thunderclap. It seeped into the room, slow and procedural, carried by the voice of a clerk whose tone betrayed nothing, as if neutrality itself were a shield against consequence. Guilty on counts of unlawful detention and conspiracy. Not guilty on homicide. A split decision, precise, cautious, devastating in its restraint. Marcus Keller stood as the words were read, absorbing a future measured in years rather than absolutes, punished for what could be proven, not for what haunted the empty spaces between facts. The courtroom exhaled, then fractured.
Some called it justice.
Others called it cowardice. Most called it inevitable. Cold cases rarely end with clean lines. They end with margins. Keller was sentenced weeks later, the judge acknowledging the limits of certainty, the weight of absence, the damage caused not only by action but by failure to act. Keller did not protest. He nodded once, as if confirming a calculation made long ago. As if this somehow fit. Rolf Hartmann watched from another building, another process, another narrowing corridor of time. His own hearings began quietly, without the spectacle that had surrounded Keller. Different charges. Different strategy. The prosecution, bruised by the first trial, moved more conservatively now, anchoring every claim to documentation, to movement, to money, to logistics. Hartmann responded with silence, so complete it bordered on performance. He stared past questioners. He corrected no one. He waited. Outside, Attention waned. The city, briefly electrified by the possibility of resolution, began to drift. New scandals emerged. Elections loomed. Headlines moved on. Only those closest to the case felt the aftershocks, the way a fracture continues to shift long after the initial break. Then, unexpectedly, Keller spoke again. From prison through his attorney, he requested a meeting with investigators. Not a deal. Not an appeal. A conversation. The request was debated, then granted, because cold cases teach a brutal lesson. You listen, even when you don't want to. Especially then. Keller looked older still, the sharp edges worn down by confinement. He did not confess. He clarified. He spoke of fear, of momentum, of moments where stopping felt harder than continuing. He described Hartman as decisive, persuasive, obsessed with control. He described himself as a man who mistook passivity for safety. He described the river, not as a place of disposal, but as a boundary, a point of no return that once crossed could not be uncrossed. He did not say what happened to Claudia Weiss. He said only that she had not suffered long. Investigators pressed. Keller shut down. The meeting ended with more information than before and no answers that mattered. Still, the statement rippled outward, interpreted, reinterpreted, weighed for hidden meaning. Some heard remorse. Others heard manipulation. The truth, as always, sat somewhere inaccessible, watching. Hartman's case advanced slowly. Evidence placed him near the spree. Witnesses identified his van. Financial records linked him to cleanup materials purchased days after Claudia vanished. But again, no body. No definitive scene. His defense leaned hard into the void, arguing that absence was not proof, but permission for doubt. The court listened. Meanwhile, a new search was authorized. Not at the industrial site. Not at the riverbank. Somewhere else entirely. A former maintenance worker, now terminally ill, had come forward after Keller's conviction. He spoke of an off-the-books dump site used briefly during redevelopment, a place where soil was moved fast, records thin, oversight minimal. He remembered two men arguing. He remembered the smell. He remembered thinking it was none of his business. Ground crews returned to the outskirts of Berlin, to land that had never been landscaped, never questioned. Excavation began again, smaller this time, quieter, almost ashamed. Days passed. Nothing. Then a fragment.
Bone, possibly human.
Too degraded for certainty. Enough to halt work and begin analysis. The results were inconclusive. The fragment could not be dated reliably. No DNA profile could be extracted. It joined the evidence limbo, another almost, another maybe, another thing that leaned toward truth without touching it. Claudia Weiss remained missing. Her mother died that winter.
No annoncement.
No statement. Just a notice in a local paper. She passed without knowing where her daughter was, without a grave to visit, without the simple cruelty of finality. The city noticed briefly, then moved on. Investigators did not. Some attended the funeral quietly, standing at a distance, unsure whether presence was comfort or intrusion. Hartman's trial approached its end. The prosecution argued that Keller's conviction, limited as it was, established a framework of shared responsibility. The defense argued contamination, that Keller's words were self-serving, shaped by conviction, designed to shift blame. The judge listened, impassive. When Hartman finally spoke, it was unexpected. He denied violence. He denied intent. He admitted logistics. He said he had helped move something heavy. He said he had asked no questions. He said he had been paid to forget. He said forgetting had been easier than remembering. The courtroom froze. The admission was enough to convict on lesser charges. Not enough to close the story. Hartman was sentenced to time that felt symbolic, punitive without being proportional, a compromise between proof and suspicion. He was led away, without looking back. The city absorbed the outcome with a muted resignation. 2 men punished. No body. No full truth. A cold case that had broken, yes, but had not healed. Years later, People would still argue about what really happened in 1993. Podcasts would dissect tone and phrasing. Articles would revisit missed chances. Students would study the case as an example of systemic delay. And somewhere in those discussions, Claudia Weiss would flicker into view, then fade again, her life forever bracketed by what could not be proven. The case did not end. It settled. And in that uneasy stillness, Berlin learned a final, uncomfortable lesson, that some mysteries are not solved by revelation, but by accumulation, and that even when the law speaks, the past does not always answer back. The settling was deceptive. From the outside, it looked like quiet, like resolution by exhaustion, but inside the institutions that had carried the case for so long, nothing truly came to rest. Files remained open in spirit, if not in status. Notes continued to accumulate in margins. The name Claudia Weiss lingered in hallways long after meetings ended, spoken softly, almost apologetically, as if saying it too loudly might expose how little had actually been resolved. Marcus Keller adjusted to prison with the efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime rehearsing restraint. He followed rules. He avoided conflict. He became, according to guards, unremarkable, a word that echoed uncomfortably with the life he had led outside. He declined interviews. He wrote letters no one saw. When asked about remorse during a mandatory evaluation, he spoke instead about inevitability, about how certain paths narrow until turning back feels impossible. The psychologist noted the language carefully, fatalism masquerading as reflection. Responsibility diluted into atmosphere. Rolf Hartmann disappeared again, this time legally. His sentence placed him in a facility far from Berlin, far from the river, far from the places where memory might ambush him. He kept his silence there too. Fellow inmates knew him only as an older man who didn't talk about his past and didn't ask about theirs. He slept lightly. He avoided windows. When pressed by counselors, he said he had learned long ago that words create obligations. Outside, the case mutated into narrative. Documentaries condensed decades into hours. Podcasts sharpened speculation into entertainment. Armchair analysts argued over Keller's phrasing, Hartmann's posture, the anonymous tipster's cadence. The story became portable, adaptable, stripped of the weight that had once crushed the people inside it. The question shifted from what happened to what does it mean, and meaning, unlike truth, is endlessly renewable. Yet even as the public moved on, the system did not entirely let go. A review commission, formed under pressure and expected to dissolve quietly, lingered longer than anticipated. Its mandate was narrow, examine procedural failures in unresolved cases from the early 90s. Its findings were anything but. Claudia Weiss's file became a case study, cited again and again as an example of compounded delay, of how minor decisions, taken in isolation, can converge into irreversible loss. The commission uncovered patterns that felt uncomfortably familiar. Misfiled evidence. Deferred follow-ups. Witnesses never recontacted because no one was assigned ownership of the question. None of it malicious. All of it lethal to clarity. The report did not accuse individuals. It accused momentum, the kind that carries people forward without asking where they are going. One footnote, almost lost, mentioned the anonymous tip. Its origin had never been traced.
Phone records were gone.
Voice analysis remained speculative. The commission recommended renewed efforts, not because it expected results, but because it argued that the act of trying mattered, that unanswered interventions erode trust long after cases close. A small team was assigned. Quietly, without deadline. They returned to the recording, listening not for identity, but for intent. The caller had not sounded afraid, nor relieved. The tone suggested calculation, restraint, someone deciding not whether to speak, but how much. Linguists debated whether the phrasing indicated distance or proximity to the events. The conclusion was unsatisfying but telling. The caller sounded like someone who had lived with the information long enough to organize it. A new theory emerged, one that shifted attention away from Keller and Hartmann without absolving them. That the tipster was not a perpetrator, nor a direct witness, but a facilitator. Someone who had helped in small ways. Transport, access, silence. Someone whose involvement had been peripheral enough to rationalize until time stripped away the excuses. The team followed that idea outward, mapping networks rather than individuals. Contractors, temporary workers, supervisors who signed off on rush jobs. One name surfaced repeatedly, never central, always adjacent. A man who had died in 2019. His widow, contacted gently, mentioned that he had talked about Berlin once, about a mistake he couldn't undo, about a woman who haunted his dreams though he'd never known her. It went nowhere, or perhaps it went exactly where it always did. The river. Environmental studies conducted years earlier showed unusual sediment shifts along a bend downstream from the original site, changes consistent with repeated dumping during redevelopment. It had never been investigated in connection with Claudia Weiss because the technology hadn't existed at the time and the will hadn't existed later. Now, with the case technically closed, reopening the river felt symbolic at best, performative at worst. Still, a survey was authorized. Sonar traced shapes beneath the surface.
Debris. Scrap.
Old machinery. Nothing definitive. The spree flowed on, opaque, indifferent, a witness that could not testify even if it wanted to. Investigators stood on the bank in silence, aware of the absurdity of asking water to give back what it had been given decades earlier. On the anniversary of Claudia's disappearance, a small plaque appeared near the tram stop in Lichtenberg.
No ceremony. No speeches.
Just a name, a date, and a sentence chosen carefully to avoid claims it couldn't support. In memory of Claudia Weiss, missing since 1993. The word missing did a lot of work. It acknowledged absence without pretending to fill it. People stopped. Read. Moved on. Somewhere in the city, the anonymous tipster heard about the plaque. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe they were already gone. Or maybe they stood among the passers-by, unnoticed, satisfied that the name was no longer trapped inside a file. Years passed.
Keller aged.
Hartmann aged. The investigators who had carried the case retired, one by one, leaving behind annotated binders and warnings scribbled on the inside covers. Don't trust the first explanation. Recheck the margins. Silence is data. Claudia Weiss did not age. She remained 32 in every photograph, every reconstruction, every retelling. Frozen at the edge of an evening she never finished. The city around her continued to transform, streets renamed, buildings replaced, histories repackaged, but the absence she left behind did not shrink with distance. It adapted. Students learned her case as a lesson in institutional memory. Journalists referenced it as shorthand for unresolved guilt. Detectives spoke of it late at night, when newer cases stalled and doubt crept in. It became a measuring stick, not of failure alone, but of consequence. And beneath all of that, a quieter truth persisted. That the cold case did not truly break the day of the arrest. It broke when someone, somewhere, decided that knowing was worse than not knowing, that carrying the truth alone was heavier than releasing it into an imperfect system. That decision did not solve the mystery. It did not redeem the past, but it changed the shape of the silence. And in that altered silence, Berlin learned to hear something it had missed before. Not answers, not closure, but the echo of responsibility, moving outward, long after the last headline faded, reminding anyone willing to listen that unresolved stories do not end. They wait. Time did what it always does when justice runs out of language. It moved forward anyway, indifferent to whether the questions behind it had been answered. Years stacked quietly on top of the case, softening its edges for the public while sharpening them for the few who could not forget how close it had come to slipping away entirely. Inside the police archives, Claudia Weiss's file was reclassified, not closed, not active, but something in between, a category reserved for cases that refused to behave. New detectives were required to read it during training, not for technique, but for temperament, to understand how certainty can mislead, how absence can masquerade as nothing, how the most dangerous moments are often the ones that feel administratively insignificant. Marcus Keller marked time by routine. His health declined gradually, predictably, the body following rules he had spent a lifetime respecting. In his later years, he agreed to one recorded interview, not for the media, but for an internal study on delayed accountability. He spoke carefully, choosing words the way he always had, constructing distance even as he spoke of proximity. He admitted fear. He admitted failure. He never crossed the line into confession. When asked if he thought the full truth would ever come out, he paused longer than usual. He said truth was not a thing that comes out. He said it was something that leaks. The recording was archived. It unsettled everyone who listened to it. Rolf Hartmann did not grant interviews. His health, too, declined, accelerated by isolation and the slow realization that disappearance was no longer possible, that even anonymity had limits once a name hardens into record. He was transferred twice. Each move peeled away another layer of control. In his final years, he wrote a letter to the court, never sent, found later among his belongings. It contained no names, no events, only a single sentence written again and again in different handwriting, as if practice might change its meaning. I thought silence was neutral. The letter joined the evidence limbo, powerful, unusable. The anonymous tip became legend. Investigators came and went, each convinced they might be the one to finally trace it back to a source, to put a voice to the catalyst that had forced the past open. Technology improved. Databases expanded. Still, the call remained unclaimed. Some believed the tipster had died. Others believed they were watching, satisfied, anonymous by choice rather than necessity. The truth was that anonymity had worked too well. It had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had acted without consequence. In the city, the plaque near the tram stop weathered. Flowers appeared occasionally, left by strangers who had learned Claudia's name long after learning how to forget others. No one knew who brought them. No one removed them either. The absence had been given a place. That alone felt radical. Academics argued over the case's legacy. Was it an example of systemic collapse or delayed resilience? Did the arrests matter if the outcome remained incomplete? Did naming suspects without full proof help or harm the pursuit of truth? There were no answers, only positions, each revealing more about the speaker than the case itself. For Claudia's remaining family, the story ended in quieter ways. A room left untouched. A box never opened. The acceptance that resolution is not a single event but a long negotiation with what will never change. They stopped attending anniversaries. They stopped speaking to journalists. They lived with the knowledge that the world had finally noticed, then moved on. One winter, after a particularly heavy flood season, workers dredging a section of the Spree found debris shifted from its original position. The discovery triggered a brief surge of attention. Forensics were called. Samples were taken. Results came back inconclusive. Again. The river had rearranged its secrets too many times. Still, the event reignited discussion inside the department. A proposal circulated quietly, not to reopen the case formally, but to document it completely, to gather every known fact, every contradiction, every unanswered question into a single narrative, not for prosecution, but for memory. The idea was approved. The work took years. The final document did not claim to solve anything. It outlined what was known, what was likely, what was impossible to verify. It resisted the urge to fill gaps with certainty. It treated silence not as failure, but as data. When it was finished, it was sealed, not classified, but protected, a record meant to outlast individuals, to wait patiently for a future that might see differently. In the closing pages, one sentence stood out, not as conclusion, but as warning. Delay does not erase truth. It only redistributes its cost. That line found its way into lectures, into policy drafts, into the margins of newer cases. Claudia Weiss's disappearance became less a mystery to be solved and more a reference point, a reminder that unresolved violence leaves fingerprints everywhere, on systems, on cities, on time itself. And still, somewhere beneath all of it, the unanswered question pulsed quietly. Where is she? Not as an accusation, Not as a demand, as an echo, a frequency that never quite faded, only lowered enough to ignore if you tried hard enough. Berlin had learned how to do that. It had learned many things. But every so often, usually late at night, when trains slowed and streets emptied, when a city's newest skin peeled back to reveal older layers beneath, that frequency rose again, just enough to remind anyone listening that the past was not gone. It was waiting, and it always would be. The story never closed. It simply reached the point where nothing more could be proven without changing what proof itself meant, and so it entered its final phase, not an ending, but a persistence, the kind that survives without witnesses, without headlines, without even hope, sustained only by the refusal to disappear completely. Years after the last court ruling, after the last appeal faded into procedural silence, Berlin looked different on the surface. New buildings rose where empty lots once absorbed secrets. Tram lines were updated. Streetlights replaced the ones that used to flicker at dawn. The city learned new rhythms, new fears, new obsessions. And yet, beneath all of it, the disappearance of Claudia Weiss remained embedded like a fault line, invisible until pressure revealed it. Marcus Keller died in custody on an unremarkable morning. Heart failure. No statement. No final words. The notification was processed, filed, archived. For a brief moment, the case stirred again, commentators asking whether death without confession was the final injustice or the final confirmation of who he had always been. Investigators read the notice in silence. Some felt nothing. Others felt something dangerously close to relief. None of them felt resolution. Rolf Hartmann followed 2 years later. Cancer. Rapid. Unforgiving. He refused spiritual counsel. He declined the chance to dictate a statement. When asked if there was anyone he wanted to contact, he said no. The man who had mastered disappearance did so one last time, leaving behind a name, a number, and a weight no sentence had ever fully carried. With both men gone, the case crossed an invisible threshold. No more testimony. No more leverage. No more pressure points. What remained was static, fixed, immune to intervention. The cold case, once broken, had hardened into something else entirely, a permanent question mark etched into institutional memory. The anonymous tip was never traced. Years of technological advancement failed to narrow it down. The voice resisted classification. The call resisted ownership. It stood alone as an act without consequence, a rupture in silence that refused to explain itself. In internal discussions, it was referred to simply as the intervention, a reminder that truth does not always arrive with permission or accountability. Some investigators believed the tipster had died soon after calling. Others believed they were still alive, quietly watching the ripple they had created. One retired detective insisted the tipster was never an individual at all, but a convergence, a moment when enough partial knowledge aligned to force action. The theory was unprovable. It lingered anyway. The final official review of the case concluded with no new findings. It confirmed what had already been learned the hard way, that Claudia Weiss had almost certainly encountered fatal violence, that multiple individuals bore responsibility, and that the physical truth of what happened to her had likely been erased by time, construction, and water. The language was careful. The implications were not. The report was released without ceremony. No press conference. No apology. Just a document uploaded to an archive, where it joined thousands of others that told similar stories with different names. For a moment, the city noticed. Then it didn't. But memory has its own logic. Every year, on the anniversary of Claudia's disappearance, someone refreshed the flowers by the plaque in Lichtenberg. No pattern. No signature. Sometimes it was a single white rose. Sometimes it was nothing but a candle burned low. No one claimed responsibility. No one tried to stop it. The ritual persisted, quiet and stubborn, proof that remembrance does not require permission. Students still asked about the case. New detectives still argued over it. Journalists still circled it when other stories ran dry. It became shorthand for everything that goes wrong slowly, invisibly, when urgency is postponed and silence is mistaken for stability. And Claudia Weiss remained at the center of it all, unchanged, unlocated, unresolved. Not a symbol, a person. A woman who stepped off a tram one evening in 1993 and never finished her walk home. A life that intersected briefly with fear, opportunity, and neglect, then vanished into a city too distracted to notice until it was too late. A presence defined not by what was known, but by what could no longer be recovered. In the end, the Berlin 1993 cold case did not end with a revelation. It ended with an understanding that some stories are not meant to be solved, only carried. That justice, delayed long enough, transforms into something quieter and heavier, a responsibility passed from one generation to the next. That absence, when ignored, does not fade. It accumulates. And somewhere, beneath the noise of a living city, beneath the traffic and construction and reinvention, the unanswered question still exists, unchanged by time or verdicts or death. What happened to Claudia Weiss? Berlin does not answer. It remembers. And in that remembering, the case remains open, not on paper, not in court, but in the only place it was ever truly alive. The silence. The silence did not stay still. It never does. It shifts, stretches, absorbs new meaning, and long after the last official word was written, long after the names Keller and Hartmann stopped provoking recognition, the space left by Claudia Weiss continued to shape decisions made by people who never knew her, never walked her route home, never saw the city as it was in 1993. A generation grew up after the case without remembering the night she vanished, but they inherited its outline anyway. Detectives trained on newer crimes found themselves hesitating in moments that once would have passed unnoticed. A missing person report filed late. A witness unsure of dates. A box checked instead of questioned. Somewhere in the back of their minds, without always knowing why, was the knowledge that delay has consequences that do not announce themselves until it is too late to reverse them. In policy meetings, Claudia's name was never spoken, but her case hovered over discussions about evidence retention, interdepartmental follow-up, and the danger of assuming that time is neutral. Time, they had learned, is an active force. It favors the prepared. It protects the patient. It punishes the distracted. The archive containing her file was moved once more, this time to a climate-controlled facility designed for permanence. Barcodes replaced handwriting. Digital cross-references replaced intuition. Progress on paper. And yet, some of the detectives insisted on keeping a printed copy of the original notes, creased, imperfect, marked with human hesitation. They said it mattered to remember how uncertainty looks when it is fresh. Occasionally, a new tip arrived. Always vague. Always late. Someone who thought they remembered a van. A voice. A scream mistaken for laughter. Each one was logged. Each one reviewed. None of them changed anything. Still, they were taken seriously because the case had taught a lesson no manual could encode. That dismissal is a decision, and decisions echo. The plaque near the tram stop was replaced after vandalism cracked the stone. The new one was simpler. No embellishment. No attempt at narrative. Just the name.
The date.
The word missing. It was enough. People continued to pass it without stopping. Some paused without knowing why. Absence has a way of asking for attention without demanding it. On quiet nights, when the city's tempo slowed and the river flattened into dark glass, former investigators admitted to feeling a pull toward the spree, a reflex born of years spent asking water for answers it could not give. They stood there sometimes, not searching, not hoping, just acknowledging the boundary between what can be known and what must be carried. One of them, long retired, once said that the most dangerous thing about unresolved cases is not that they lack answers, but that they teach the wrong people the wrong lessons. That silence works. That time erases. That patience absolves. Claudia Weiss's case had interrupted that lesson, imperfectly, but enough. It had shown that silence leaves residue. In universities, the case entered curricula not as a mystery, but as a warning. Students debated ethics instead of suspects. They argued about institutional responsibility instead of individual guilt. Some found that unsatisfying. Others found it honest. The absence of a body forced the discussion into uncomfortable territory, where certainty could not hide behind proof. Years later, a young woman living near Lichtenberg wrote an essay about the plaque she passed every morning. She had looked up the name once, fallen into the story by accident, and never quite climbed back out. She wrote about how strange it was to live next to a question, how it changed the way she thought about routine, about safety, about the thin line between return and disappearance. Her professor wrote one comment in the margin, "This is why we remember." Nothing new emerged. No final confession surfaced. No hidden grave was uncovered by chance or flood or redevelopment. The river kept what it had been given. The city kept moving. That was never in doubt. What changed was quieter. When another woman went missing years later, in a different part of Berlin, the response was immediate. The search broad. The assumptions challenged early. Someone mentioned Claudia Weiss in a briefing, not as comparison, but as reminder. No one objected. That case ended differently. Not because the city had become better, but because it had become more aware of how quickly not looking becomes habit. Claudia's absence had left behind a sensitivity, faint but persistent, like scar tissue that remembers pressure. In that sense, the Berlin 1993 cold case did something rare. It did not resolve. It transformed. It became part of the city's reflexes, its cautionary muscle memory, a low hum beneath decision-making that asked, quietly but insistently, what if this is the moment that matters? And somewhere beyond reports and plaques and lectures, beyond verdicts and theories and carefully worded conclusions, the truth remained exactly where it had always been. Incomplete, unreachable, resistant to narrative. Claudia Weiss did not return.
She did not speak.
But she endured. In the systems reshaped by her absence. In the questions asked sooner rather than later. In the pauses where someone chose to look again instead of moving on. In the understanding that some stories are not solved by answers, but by vigilance. The case stayed open in the only way that mattered. As a warning. As a memory. As a silence that no longer went unnoticed. The warning did not fade. It settled deeper, embedding itself not just in procedure but in instinct, the kind that activates before logic catches up, and years after the case had stopped generating paperwork, it continued to influence choices made in rooms that never spoke Claudia Weiss's name aloud. There were nights when the city felt almost cooperative, when Berlin seemed to offer up its secrets willingly, when missing persons were found quickly, when timelines aligned, when the old fear loosened its grip just enough to suggest progress. And then there were nights when the city closed again, tight and unreadable, reminding everyone that vigilance does not guarantee victory, only the chance to fail less completely. The archive copy of the Weiss case was accessed more often than expected. Not reopened. Consulted. Detectives read it the way sailors read weather, looking not for answers, but for patterns that repeat when no one is paying attention. The margins mattered more than the conclusions. The pauses between actions. The moments when something felt off but not urgent enough to challenge. One detective, newly assigned to cold cases decades later, noticed something small that no one had ever framed as significant. A gap of 42 minutes between Claudia's last confirmed sighting and the payphone call that had once been dismissed as noise. 42 minutes in which nothing was logged, nothing reported, nothing proven. The detective wrote a note in the file, not a theory, just a sentence. That is enough time for everything. The note changed nothing. It stayed. The anonymous tip continued to haunt quietly. Once a year, without fail, someone submitted a request to re-examine it using whatever new technology had emerged. Voice modeling, behavioral patterning, emotional residue analysis. Each attempt failed differently. The call resisted classification like a thought designed not to be owned. Some began to suspect that was the point, that anonymity was not a shield but the message itself. Whoever made the call had understood something essential. That the truth did not need a face to be dangerous. Across the city, redevelopment continued. A parking structure replaced a derelict lot. A cafe opened where offices once stood. People drank coffee on foundations poured over years that had never been properly accounted for. The ground held its silence well. It always had. Sometimes, during routine inspections, workers reported odd smells rising briefly from drains near the river, then disappearing. Nothing traceable, nothing consistent. The reports were logged, investigated, closed. But they triggered a familiar unease, a reminder that cities metabolize their past rather than expel it. The spree flooded again one spring, higher than forecast, spilling into areas previously untouched. Emergency crews worked through the night. Debris surfaced. Old things. Broken things. Nothing identifiable. Nothing that could speak. Still, the image lingered, water returning what it could not keep forever, offering fragments without explanation. In the years that followed, Claudia Weiss's case began appearing in places no one expected. In novels. In art installations. In a short film screened at a festival, never naming her directly, but capturing the sensation of a person vanishing between stops. Some criticized it as exploitation. Others defended it as preservation. The line between the two remained uncomfortable and unresolved. What mattered was that the absence was still felt. One evening, long after the case had stopped being discussed in official settings, a former tram driver stood near the plaque in Lichtenberg, watching people pass. He had been the last person to see Claudia alive, though he had not known it at the time. He had told his story so often it had lost shape, reduced to a smile and a timestamp. That night, he stood longer than usual. He later said he wasn't waiting for anything. He was acknowledging something. That the ordinary moments we discard without thought are often the ones that endure the longest. As the city aged, as generations replaced one another, the question of what happened to Claudia Weiss softened at the edges, but never dissolved. It became less accusatory, more reflective, less about blame and more about cost. The cost of assuming someone else would notice. The cost of trusting systems built to move forward rather than look back. In internal seminars, instructors began ending sessions with a phrase borrowed from the Weiss Review document, stripped of context, offered without explanation.
What are we not seeing yet?
The question lingered. It followed people home. It followed them into silence. And in that way, the Berlin 1993 cold case achieved something no verdict ever could. It refused to become history. It resisted the past tense. It lived on as pressure, as discomfort, as a quiet refusal to allow disappearance to feel normal. Claudia Weiss remained missing. But she was no longer invisible. Not to the city. Not to the systems reshaped by her absence. Not to the silence that had learned, finally, that it would be listened to. And so the story continued, not forward, not backward, but outward, diffusing into the decisions of people who would never know her name unless they chose to look it up, unless they paused at a plaque, unless they felt, without fully understanding why. That some questions are not meant to be answered once. They are meant to be kept alive. And Berlin, for all its noise and reinvention and forgetting, kept this one. The keeping of it changed the city in ways that were difficult to measure and impossible to chart. Not dramatic shifts. Not revolutions. Just a subtle tightening, like a grip that never fully relaxes once it has known loss. Berlin carried the question the way it carried history in general, layered, partially buried, occasionally exposed by pressure or chance. Years after the case had slipped from public consciousness, a municipal audit flagged an anomaly buried deep in old infrastructure records. A storage facility near the river, decommissioned in the late 90s, had been listed as cleared twice, once by a private contractor, once by the city, with no documentation in between. The discrepancy was small. It did not trigger alarms. It might have been ignored entirely if not for a junior analyst who had studied the Weiss case in university and recognized the address. Nothing came of it. The building had been demolished long ago. Soil replaced. Foundations sealed. Whatever had been there was gone, or indistinguishable from everything else that had passed through that space. Still, the notation was added to the archive. Another footnote. Another almost. Those almosts accumulated over time, Not enough to solve anything, but enough to suggest that the past had not been as thoroughly erased as it pretended to be. It existed in gaps, in duplications, in administrative shadows where responsibility had blurred just enough to let certainty slip through. The anonymous tipster remained absent, but their influence evolved. In lectures and internal briefings, the call was no longer framed as a turning point, but as a fracture, the moment when the story stopped belonging to a small group of investigators and became something larger, less controllable. The call had not answered questions. It had redistributed them. Some believed that was the most unsettling part, because questions once shared do not disappear. They migrate. On the streets near Lichtenberg, residents who had never heard of Claudia Weiss still adjusted their routines instinctively. They walked together at night. They noticed when someone didn't return. They called earlier. They followed up. None of this was dramatic. It was quiet, habitual, learned behavior passed down without explanation, like superstition disguised as common sense. Every city has its ghosts. Berlin's were unusually articulate. In a retired investigator's apartment, boxes of case notes gathered dust. He had meant to throw them out more than once. Each time, he stopped. Not because he believed they would ever matter again, but because they represented attention, and attention, once given, felt wrong to withdraw. He died with the boxes still there. His daughter donated them to an archive, where they joined the official record, unofficial but sincere. The act mattered more than the content, because it confirmed something the case had taught over decades, that truth is not only what can be proven, but what people are unwilling to let go of. Occasionally, someone claimed to have new information. A dream, a memory triggered by a documentary, a confession delivered secondhand. Each was handled carefully, respectfully, and then folded back into the silence.
No ridicule. No dismissal.
The city had learned better. And Claudia Weiss remained where she had always been, just beyond reach, her absence defined not by neglect anymore, but by vigilance, without reward. There were nights when the plaque was gone in the morning, removed temporarily for cleaning or repair, and people noticed immediately. Calls were made. Questions asked. The absence of the marker caused more concern than its presence ever had. It was replaced quickly. The message was clear. This will not be erased again. The Berlin 1993 cold case no longer belonged to the past. It had become a reference point for the present and a warning aimed at the future. Not loud, not heroic, persistent. And in that persistence, something unexpected took shape. A form of justice that did not depend on answers. Justice as attention. Justice as refusal. Justice as the decision, made again and again, to look where it would be easier not to. Claudia Weiss did not receive closure, but she received witnesses. And as long as those witnesses remained, scattered across generations, across systems, across quiet moments when someone chose to ask one more question instead of moving on, the silence surrounding her disappearance was no longer empty. It was occupied by memory, by caution, by a city that had learned, too late but not too late to matter, that unresolved stories do not weaken with time. They deepen. And Berlin carried this one forward, not toward an ending, but into a future shaped by the knowledge that some absences demand to be felt forever. By the time the story reached its 15th year of being retold, re-examined, and quietly inherited, it no longer belonged to any one institution or generation. It had thinned out, spread wide, embedded itself into the city's habits the way weather does, unnoticed until it shifts. Berlin had learned how to live with unresolved weight. New investigators no longer spoke about the Weiss case with frustration. They spoke about it with precision. It had become a calibration point, a way to measure how easily certainty can be manufactured when patience runs out. They didn't ask how it could have been solved differently. They asked how many other cases were drifting toward the same quiet failure without anyone realizing it yet. The city's relationship with disappearance changed. Missing no longer meant gone. It meant present in another way. Present in procedures rewritten. In timelines shortened. in the refusal to wait for patterns to become obvious. Claudia Weiss's absence had trained a reflex, act before silence settles in. And still, the silence endured. One autumn, a maintenance crew working near an old flood barrier uncovered an object lodged deep in silt. Rusted. Unremarkable. A fragment of something that could have belonged to anyone. Forensics examined it.
Catalogued it.
Ruled it out. The report was brief. The effect was not. It reopened a familiar ache, the reminder that the city still occasionally exhaled pieces of its past without explanation. People talked about it for a week. Then they stopped. Not because it didn't matter, but because they had learned the difference between movement and meaning. The plaque remained. Weathered. Scratched. Cleaned by hands that never left names. Tourists walked past it now, sometimes stopping, sometimes photographing it without understanding what they were capturing. Locals noticed who paused longer than necessary. That pause had become a kind of signal, a recognition that something here did not resolve itself. In private moments, former investigators admitted to dreaming about the case. Not the crime. Not the suspects. The moment before. The window where everything was still possible. Where one phone call, one follow-up, one decision might have shifted the entire trajectory. The dreams never ended differently. They simply replayed the tension of almost. That was the true legacy. Not failure.
Proximity.
The anonymous tip faded from active conversation, but never from consciousness. It had done its work without asking for credit, a reminder that intervention does not guarantee redemption. Sometimes it only ensures that silence cannot pretend to be innocence anymore. Claudia Weiss became a name people recognized, without always remembering why. That recognition mattered. It meant the story had outgrown spectacle. It had settled into something more durable. Responsibility. The city never found her. No confession tied cleanly to fact. No remains offered certainty. No final sentence wrapped the narrative in clarity. The cold case stayed cold in the only way that truly mattered. Unfinished. But the unfinished no longer felt empty. It felt occupied by attention, by caution, by the collective agreement that disappearance is not an acceptable outcome simply because time has passed. That unresolved does not mean irrelevant. That some questions earn the right to persist. In the end, the Berlin 1993 cold case did not demand an answer. It demanded awareness. And Berlin, scarred and complicated and endlessly in motion, learned to give it that. Not perfectly. Not always. But enough to ensure that Claudia Weiss was not lost a second time. Not to silence. Not to convenience. Not to forgetting. The city carried her absence forward, not as a wound to be closed, but as a pressure to remain awake. And as long as that pressure existed, as long as someone stopped at the plaque, reread an old file, hesitated before dismissing a detail, the story did not end. It remained, waiting, not for closure, but for attention. Attention, once learned, does not dissolve easily. It reshapes how a city listens to itself, how it hears the quiet signals that once blended into background noise. Berlin carried that change forward, not ceremonially, not consciously, but instinctively, like a body that has learned where it is vulnerable. Years passed without incident. That, too, became part of the legacy. The absence of repetition. The lack of another name added to the same pattern. When disappearances did occur, they were met with urgency sharpened by memory, with an understanding that the first hours are not a preface, they are the story. Claudia Weiss lived there now, in the beginning of every response, invisible but present. The file bearing her name was rarely opened anymore, but it was never archived into irrelevance. It remained active in a different sense, cited not for facts, but for posture. How investigators were taught to sit with uncertainty without surrendering to it. How to treat silence as pressure rather than permission. How to resist the comfort of assuming someone else will notice. In a quiet office overlooking the river, a senior official once described the case not as a failure, but as a scar. Something healed enough to function, but sensitive enough to warn. The metaphor spread. It felt accurate. Scars do not explain what happened. They explain what must be protected. The spree continued its cycles. Flood and retreat. Freeze and thaw. It held its opacity without apology. No one expected it to give anything back anymore. The river had been recast, not as accomplice or witness, but as boundary. A reminder that some answers lie beyond reach and that insisting otherwise can blind you to what is still possible. Occasionally, someone new discovered the case for the first time. A student, a journalist, a resident who had just moved into the neighborhood. They approached it with fresh hunger, with the expectation that persistence alone could unlock it. They asked the same questions. They traced the same paths. Eventually, they reached the same edge. Most stopped there. A few stayed. Those few did not look for solutions anymore. They looked for implications. What the case revealed about timing, about trust, about how systems fail quietly long before they fail publicly. Their work did not reopen the case. It reinforced its lesson. Claudia Weiss became a fixed point